Hey there, welcome to day 25. In this one, we are going to be building a web application from scratch in Python without any sort of web framework. Now, web framework is something like Django or Flask. I'll get into more why you would want to use those later. But for now, all you need to know is we are going to be building a pure web application using one package called gunicorn using Python. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing I need to do is open up VS Code into the folder of day 25, and I want to navigate into that folder for the development process. I'm going to be using pip env, and I'm going to go ahead and install gunicorn. That is the only dependency we have here, and we're going to be doing Python 3.8. Okay, so while that's installing, I'm going to go ahead and create my server file. I'm actually not going to be using Jupyter Notebooks here. You definitely can, but I'm not going to be. I'm just going to be using very simple Python files here. Okay, so let's close down the Explorer. I've got my server. Now, what is it that the server needs to do? Now, the first thing is, whenever you use a web application, you're going to have some sort of app that's going to actually handle that web application. So this app is just a simple function. It could be a class that has a method in it, but the idea here is this single function is going to accept a request and return a response. So just think of it in terms of request, response. Because every time you go to a web page of any kind, you are requesting something from that web page, and then that web page will respond something back to you. If you get no response, that means the web page is down, of course, right? So that is another possibility that could happen here. So what I want to do is actually build this out a little bit more than just this basic request response, because what gunicorn is going to allow us to do, so gunicorn is actually going to be our web server gateway interface. That gets a little bit complicated, but this essentially is handling the request for us and looking for our function or any sort of application that's going to be handling the vast majority of web requests themselves, right? So gunicorn is kind of the middleman from the server to our Python application that is absolutely necessary, but we don't actually need to know much about it other than what it does to run it and then what it passes initially. So what it passes is two variables into this application. So it's environ and start response. Okay, so start response is a method that you can call to actually have some sort of response going. Right, so this takes in a few arguments. The first argument is going to be our status code. So the status code of 200 saying okay. I'll discuss the status code things in just a moment. And then we also want to pass in some headers that are going to come back here. So the first thing I'm going to do is a content type header. And this is going to be text, or rather text/plain. So just pure old plain text. And then we want to actually return the length of the content that we have, which I'll explain as well in just a moment. And that's going to be a string of, some sort of length here. So I'll just go ahead and say ABC for just a moment. And then finally, we need to return an iterable with the actual response itself as a list. This is the baseline needs that we have for gunicorn. So I'm actually going to use what they have in their documentation. So we'll just go ahead and say data equals to a byte string of hello world. And I'm going to turn it into a byte string by doing data dot encode and UTF-8. It's a type of encoding that we use for a byte string. And now in this content length header, I just want to pass in the length of that data. Okay, so it's going to count how long this data is or how many bytes are in there, and that's going to be returned back to the web browser. And then finally, we pass that data here. Okay, so right here, we have our baseline web application that gunicorn can run. So let's actually run it with gunicorn. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the terminal with Control tilde. And in here, I've got a server.py file. And inside of that server.py, I have an app function. Now, those names, the module and the function name itself, can absolutely be anything you'd like. Just keep it in this format. So the first thing is I want to run this. I'm going to go ahead and go into the pipenv shell, make sure my virtual environment's activated, and then we'll go ahead and do gunicorn. So that's the name of the command that we want to run. And this is absolutely a command that's production ready, as in if you brought a real web application live into a live server, you could totally run this. Like gunicorn is one of them that I use all the time. So codingforentrepreneurs.com uses gunicorn as its primary thing. So next we would just do server, as in the module where app is. So server : app, and then I'll just do -- reload. What -- reload is going to allow me to do is whenever I change or save server.py, gunicorn will just refresh. If I didn't have that, I would have to cancel it out and then rerun it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Notice that I get a URL here, right? So I open up this URL, and what I see is hello world. Okay, so a number of things happen here that are going on behind the scenes. But the first thing is the web browser is the actual thing that is parsing the response for us, right? So if we look back at our code, and I'm just going to minimize the terminal, I'll keep it running. But if we look at our response here, we've got a 200 response. So the browser understands, hey, this is an okay response. You can do something with this. And then the next thing is, what is the content type that's coming through here? Right now, it's just plain text. It's just treating it as plain text. The next thing is how long is this content? Like how much data is actually coming back from there? All of those things the browser likes to know. Now, can you take away any of these things? So if I cut that away, and let's just make sure the server refreshed. Looks like it said worker reloading. The server is modified. Good. And let's jump back into Chrome. I refresh in here, and you know what? It still loads. What if I actually get rid of the content type one as well? So I'll get both of these, save it. Again, let's make sure it reloaded. Looks like it did. And I come back in here, still running. Okay. So these headers are things that you should include, right? But as you see, the modern web browsers are really robust and start to understand how things are without you needing to explicitly say how things are on the back end, right? So there was a time in web browser history that you had to be very, very explicit to everything that was coming in here, and it wouldn't just infer what your web application is trying to do, right? So we've gone past that time, and now things like Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Edge, all of these things are now really equipped to handling responses from a server, even if they're not perfect responses, right? So let's take this a little bit further, though, right? So all I did was hello world. What I actually want to do is actually return some, HTML. I want to actually have a web page that's running. So I'm going to go ahead and define here, and we'll just call this render template. Okay, so I'm going to give it a template name, and I'll just pass index.html. Those of you who know how to build websites just using HTML are very familiar with index.html, but essentially that means the root of the web application, which I'll get back to in just a moment as well. Okay, so I have a template name of index.html. Before I do anything with that template name, I'm just going to return a very poorly formatted HTML string. So I'll just say h1, and that's hello. Okay, so I slightly changed what the data was, and it's returning a string of hello. Okay, so render template. This is actually now going to be my data. So I'm going to get rid of this line. I'll just comment it out, and I'll go ahead and say data equals to calling that render template. And again, this should just give me a string back. I still want to encode it, and so I save that. So the expected result, if you know how to build websites with just HTML, is this is going to render out a much bigger format than the old one, right? But if we go like this should actually be, uppercase. It should, or not uppercase, rather. It should be a header. It should be a much bigger content item here, or at least that's what I'm hoping. So I refresh in here. What the heck happened? These are called HTML tags. That is how HTML is rendered, but it's not actually showing it. Now this is where those headers actually do make a difference from time to time, right? So if I'm explicitly saying this is plain text, then the browser will actually honor that. It's going to say, okay, we'll render it out as plain text. If I change it to being HTML text and save that, refresh, there it goes. It renders out as proper HTML, right? So hello, this is now that H1 header. And if I inspect the element here by right click or control click on Chrome and go ahead and hit inspect, we see that it is inside of H1, right? Now again, I actually didn't have very good template code here. Like H1 is not a good HTML document at all. But the general idea is here is we are now getting closer to having some sort of data that's coming through inside of our application. Now, before I go any further with making the render template work, what I want to know is how do I actually handle what's called routing or URL routing? So you are probably familiar with going to different URLs here, right? So if I went to hello-world, that is actually a different path on this page. Like this is a brand new web page, or in theory it is, right? But it's still showing me the exact same content. Okay, so the reason that is we don't actually handle it at all. So how our application works right now is it just completely ignores routing altogether. It's just rendering out one thing over and over again, and that's this hello string here, right? So we can actually adjust that by using a parameter inside of something that GUnicorn sends to us, which is this environ passing argument, right? So environ is actually a dictionary, which we can see. I know it's a dictionary, but I'm going to go ahead and just iterate through it. So I can say for kvn environ.items, as in key values. We'll just go ahead and print out what those key values are. So I'll save that and open back up my terminal here. Okay, so it should have reloaded. So now I'm going to go ahead and just refresh this page here. And what I see is a bunch of data about this request, right? So if you're familiar with Django, this is what also comes in to the Django request object. That's not any different with Flask or Fast API. A lot of this data comes through a request object is what they call it. But in this case, it's called environ, or at least that's what GUnicorn calls it in their documentation. But the idea is, look at what we've got here. We've got a raw URI, or Uniform Resource Indicator. We have the host, as in the host that's actually calling this, which is that URL that GUnicorn gave to us before, right? So if this was live, it'd probably be the domain name of your web application. And if we go any further, we can start seeing a bunch of things about this, right? So HTTP accept, look at that. We've got text HTML. Now, why is it text.html or text/HTML rather? Because of our content type here, okay? A couple other things that we can see is path info. Path info being, hey, that is the actual path that we went to, right? There it is. We also can see the scheme that's happening. So HTTP, it's not HTTPS, obviously. Gives us the port that we're requesting and all of this really cool data, right? So what I want to do then is add in one more aspect, and that is a query parameter, and add a Q, or a question mark rather, and then I'll say query equals to, I don't know, hi there, and hit enter. And now let's take a look at those headers. So if we scroll up, we've got request method and a query string. So this is actually showing me the query that's coming in there. It also gives me the raw URI still, so that entire path that is happening or that we are requesting. But the actual path itself hasn't changed, right? So the path itself doesn't actually take into account the query string that's there. So that's something cool to know about. Now, why would we actually have a query string? Well, this actually gives me some additional data that I could use in the future. I'm not going to use it, but it is cool to know that it's there and how we would actually grab it. So now let's go ahead and minimize the terminal itself. Now let's go ahead and actually use the path in here. So what I want to do is actually change the routing. I want to actually render a different quote unquote template depending on the route that I'm requesting. Okay, so how do I actually get that route again? Now I just printed all that data out, and the path was in environ.get, and that's path underscore info. Okay, so again, if we look at the terminal itself and we scroll down, we see here's the key, here's the value. So path info will give me that path. Okay, so now, minimizing the terminal again, I'll go ahead and say if path equals to the just a pure slash. So this is the index. This is the index slash root of the app, or rather the web app. And then if I do have that, what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and say data equals to render template. And this time I'm going to go ahead and pass in template name equals to index.html. And then otherwise, I want to render a 404 page. Okay. I'm no longer going to have those environment items coming through. Go ahead and get rid of that. Okay. And I'll get rid of this data call here as well. We save that. Okay, so naturally this render template either way is going to be rendering out index.html. So it's still the same. So what I want to do then is say, well, I actually want to adjust this. But before I do that, let's go ahead and actually add in one more argument here. And I'll just add in the path argument for a moment. And we'll just at least show that that path argument is working using an F string here. And these curly brackets, and if you do path equals, like putting that equals in there, it's going to render out the variable name path as well as equals and what it actually is equal to, as we'll see in just a moment. So I'll just pass in path into this rendering argument as well. Okay, there we go. And now it should refresh. So if I refresh in here, I see my new path, right? And there's my home page or the index page, ABC, and so on. Like I can do whatever I need to do with this path. And that's pretty cool with F strings if you haven't seen that yet. It's one of those newer things with Python. I think it started in 3.6, but it's definitely available in 3.8 and above. Okay, so now let's actually start to build this out into a little bit more realistic of a web application. Like, let's render the templates based off of their names, not necessarily the path here, right? So essentially what I want to do is have a way to route the paths and then choose a template based off of that routing. Okay. So we already started doing that, but I want to do it in a little bit different way. So the first thing I need to do is actually make this render template thing work. So to do this, I want to come in here and say HTML string equals to an empty string. And then we'll go ahead and say with open template name. Right, so this template name that's being passed, we're going to open that up, and we're just going to read it as a file, or as f, as the argument of f, and then we'll go ahead and say HTML string equals to f.read, and then we'll just turn that HTML string back. Okay, so naturally, you're like, hey, I don't have an index.html page. Well, let's go ahead and save it. Let's see what happens if I try to render this now. If I refresh in here, I'm getting a page. This is not working, right? And if I look back in my terminal where my server was running, it's giving me a file not found error, right? So 404.html just doesn't exist. And the reason, of course, is because we are trying to call it right here, and then we try to open it up. So let's go ahead and make that. So inside of day 25, let's go and we're going to make a couple different files in here. So index.html, and then we will go ahead and do 404.html. Okay. So web applications that have a framework, so the stuff like Django or Flask, use more robust templating than what I'm about to do. What I'm going to do is just very basic HTML templates or HTML pages that will just render out. So this is going to be exclamation mark doc type HTML. And it's going to take in HTML. And then we can put in a head tag here and then a title tag and say pure Python web app. Okay, and then a body tag. And this will just be hello world. Okay, I'll copy this, bring that same thing over to 404.html, And this one will just be 404 page not found. Okay, so we now have those two documents. Okay, and our server should now be able to render those things out. We're refreshing here. Inside of ABC, we've got 404 page not found. Our home page, hello world. All right, pretty cool. Very useful, I would say. But there is one thing that perhaps I want to add in here, and that is this path, right? So maybe I actually want to render the path if it's a valid path that I'm looking for, right? So let's go ahead and change how our template does things by being able to pass in some context to it. So I did this path argument before. This time I'm going to just go ahead and say context equals to an empty dictionary. And what I'll use is the format method that Python has. So HTML string equals to HTML string dot format, and we'll unpack the context dictionary here. Now, if you're not familiar with what this does, I'll just show you real quick by jumping into the Python shell. So let's say, for instance, we have some data here, and we'll say path, and that's equals to ABC. Okay, so unpacking data, you can't actually do it unless you have a function. So we'll say define hello, and this is just going to be keyword args, and then I'll just print out keyword args. So to actually use data here, we say hello and unpack data, hit enter, and it actually unpacks each data element that comes in there, right? So if we change data again and said this and ABC and do that again, it's coming through. So another way to think about this is if I said hello, or let's define hello again, and path equals to that, and then keyword args, and we just want to print out path. Okay, and now I actually unpack that data. It actually prints out the valid keyword argument that's in there. So it unpacks them and assigns them where it's necessary. Okay, that is a basic thing, but very useful. So that's why we did this context here, because with format, as you hopefully know, what you can do is you can pass in other arguments here. So if I can pass in path, and remember, this is going to be rendered out to a string. So when we're in our server, it's going to open this up, read it to a string, and then it's going to replace any context value that's in two places, right? So it's in the context dictionary here, but then it's also in the template itself. So in this case, path will be replaced with any context argument that I have in here for path, right? So any of these things will be replaced in that string for the 404 page, not for the index page, but the 404 page. Okay, the index page would actually render any other context that we add into it, or none at all if we don't have any. Okay, so we save that. This time, instead of path equaling to path, we'll go ahead and say context equals to, path and path. Just a slight change to turning it into a dictionary, which we'll get to why in a moment. So we save that, we refresh, our home page didn't change. If I go to a 404 page, now it's giving me the actual path in there. Of course, this is not the only way that I could do a 404 page or rendering context. What I'm trying to do is show you what we would work towards when you actually use other web applications that have all this stuff kind of figured out for you, as in how to render templates out already figured out, like Django and Flask already do. All right, so now that we can actually see that we handle routing a little bit, I only handled two kinds of routes, right? So one that we know about, and then all others. So what we want to do is actually have a function that handles both of these things, right? So basically I want to say, hey, path ABC, I want that to be a new route that I handle, and I handle it in a specific way. So that means that I'm going to actually pass in a few extra arguments here, just slightly different. So the first thing is I'm going to go ahead and define a home page, and let's go ahead and take in the request itself. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass in environ as the request. And then I'm going to go ahead and return a template, right? So I'm going to return this same render template call here. Okay. So we can separate it out just a little bit. All right. So this is now my home page. So what I want to do then is just pass in or return. So data equals to home, that actual function, and passing in environ. Okay. So perhaps I actually want to pass in the path inside of environ, but it's actually not necessary. I'm going to recall that path in here if I need to use that context. And in my index page, I probably actually don't. So I don't even know if I need that data. So since I don't know if I need it or not, I'm just going to get rid of it and leave empty context. Okay. So we now have a way to map, a function, some sort of handler for any given path. Let's try this with a different path. Let's say, for instance, we'll call this contact us or contact user, either one. Now, in this case, I would have a different template because it's a different page that I actually want to render. And I'll call this contact. And do I need additional data inside of contact? Well, probably not. I don't see why I would necessarily need that. So down here, all I need to do is say elif path equals to contact. Then I'll go ahead and say data equals to contact us environ. Okay, so let's go ahead and make that contact.html page here. Really simply, I'm just going to copy index.html, and we'll go ahead and add something in here. And I'll go ahead and say contact.html, and we'll go ahead and do h1 contact us. Okay, so we save that. Server's running, and let's go ahead and take a look at it. We refresh. That page is not found. Go into contact. There it is. Now, if I actually put a trailing slash at the end, I get a page not found error here. So another thing we could do is, well, a couple things. I could say if path ends with trailing slash, then I can just say path equals to path up to -1, as in it will remove that trailing slash. And then all of these other ones potentially could work except for that one, right? Except for the index path itself. So we would have to change that to just an empty string then. We refresh. Now contact works for both, with or without the trailing slash. The index page also works with or without that slash too. So we're now like a lot closer to handling all sorts of really cool things with a web application. But I actually didn't want to build a full-on web application here, but rather I wanted to show you just generally what's under the hood of many of these web app frameworks. Now, web applications get much, much better if you actually have a database of some kind associated to them. And they also get much better when you have security, all sorts of security associated to them as well. These things I'm not going to be covering here because it's just really outside the context of what I was trying to help you learn here, which is that Python is very robust and very useful across many different applications. And also building a web application is actually not that hard to do. Making a great web application is hard, but building a very basic one is not. Now, I actually didn't follow a standard format here at all. Instead, I just wanted to show you that GUnicorn gives us some data that we can modify our requests with however we see fit, right? So these paths, I can do whatever I want with them, and I have the flexibility and robustness to do that. And as it stands right now, I could actually deploy this to a web application system, some sort of host, and actually have it run. It would actually run. Now, in, I think, day 14, we talked about ngrok. So ngrok is a way to tunnel a web application somewhere. So I could say ngrok and HTTP, and then 8000, which if you remember back to when we started GUnicorn, that is the URL that we get, right? So 8000 here. So if I did ngrok HTTP 8000, what I can see, what I get from that is a URL. This is a live functioning URL that I can go to that literally gives me the same thing. So contact, and there you go. Right? So this is now a live actual URL, And of course, if I actually went to the HTTPS version of this, it would also work, right? So this is a secure now version of this web application that I just created in, under 30 minutes probably, which is pretty cool. Of course, when I take it down from ngrok, it's no longer there, and that web address is no longer available. But this is a really fast and easy way to make a web application. Now, do I recommend that you use something more like Flask or Fast API if you are doing a bare bones one? Absolutely. So the question then is, when do I actually choose doing something minimal like this, even on my own, versus using a framework, versus using a full-fledged framework like Django? And my general answer is this. If you are going to be using this internally, as in no users, nobody outside your network is ever going to see this, you could totally do something like this. That's completely fine. If you have users using it, or you want a little bit more robust of a system, but not so robust that it has everything in it, you're going to want to use either Fast API or Flask. There are other ones like AIO HTTP and Sarlet. There's so many out there because, as you see, it's not that actually hard to create one. And then if you want to go full-fledged, Django's the way to go. Right, so Django has a lot of built-in features to it that these other ones don't. You can always add features to them, but Django is going to be the top one when you just plug and play type of thing going for it. So that's pretty cool. So if you have any questions on how to build a web app in this way, please let me know. I would challenge you to try and actually take what we did with some of the CSV storage parts of things and see if you can actually, get specific content from CSV storage that will actually render out in any given path. I think that would be a really useful practice from here to actually really start to grasp exactly how these things work. So what we did here is called the view template, kind of response kind of application, right? So adding a database would add the model portion of it. Model as in actually storing data in a database that we can grab. And then we've got the view template response, which this part, MVT, that is actually what Django really strives with in a big way. Where Flask and Fast API are more in this view template thing. If you want to get a little bit more technical, you may have heard of model view controller, potentially for web applications. That's another type of way to discuss how this works. But really all we did was view and template because we only have functions that render out some sort of template here, and we can pass any of that additional context as a dictionary, and then we just replaced it with stuff like that. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.